Hey, confirmation students, glad to be with you to record the makeup lesson for unit 3.4. Remember, this third unit we've been in talking about living forgiven. We've talked about confession and absolution, or the office of the keys. We've talked about law and gospel. Last time we met together, we talked about two kinds of righteousness, active righteousness and passive righteousness. Today, we're going to talk about Christian callings, a part of your catechism called the Table of Duties, where the Bible teaches us how to go about our lives in various stations to which our God has called us. And that might not make a lot of sense to you now, but hopefully by the end of the lesson, you'll understand what I'm talking about. You're going to want to be on page 58 in your workbook. There's a little illustration at the top that has some blanks in it. There are little gray lines that are blank. And as you see the charts develop, you're going to want to write in. There's not a whole lot to write in. And then as we go through this lesson, you'll follow along at the bottom of page 58, these American vocational oversights, things we overlook when it comes to our callings as God's people in the world. Okay, so here we go. Let's go ahead and look. What is a vocation? It's not the word vacation, that's an O there. A vocation is sometimes thought of as a job. If you have vocational training, for instance, you're being taught to do a job, but you may think of a vocation as, what do you want to be when you grow up? Do you want to be a doctor, a lawyer, a nurse, a plumber, a teacher, whatever it may be? Those are all different vocations. Now, sometimes we just call them jobs, but I think vocation is a better word because vocation has that word vocal or voice. You hear that it's a calling. In Latin, vocatio means to call. And so we see jobs not just as things we do to make money, but they're actually callings from God, places God calls us to in our work. So, a teacher could think, hey, I go to work, I teach these kids so that I make money, but probably a teacher sees it as much deeper than that. It's a calling. He or she is specially gifted to be able to teach children, and that's their calling in life. That's what God has called them to do. God works through that teacher to teach the kids. Or maybe your sink's broke and you need someone to fix it, and you're not very good at those kind of things. God will bring someone into your house who has a calling to fix things, and maybe a plumber who can do that. So all these different ways that we're served. And what Luther taught was very important is that everyday stuff is sacred. If you wanted to be considered holy in Luther's day, you had to go join the monastery and be a monk and just, stay in a castle and pray all day. And what Luther realized is that really doesn't help your neighbor in the world at all. And he taught that what is spiritual is not what we normally think. It's not only praying or going to church or things like that, but many things should be considered spiritual. Hey, doing your chores, taking out the trash, mowing the grass, cooking dinner. These are all holy callings from God. They look ordinary and mundane, but they're the way the world goes round, and God works in and through them. And Luther had this famous saying. He said, a milkmaid milking her cows, she does a better work than any monk ever has. Why did he say that? Well, who is a monk helping by staying all locked up in a cloister all day and praying? He may be doing a good thing by praying, but he can't help his neighbor there. But a milkmaid, she puts milk on the table for a family so that they can be nourished and fed and grow. That's a holy work. True good works are never done for God, but they always are done to serve our neighbor. Martin Luther once said, God does not need our good works. He'll be doing just fine without them. But our neighbor always needs our good works. And so we need to rethink about how important the everyday things of life are. Luther had this famous saying. He said, all occupations are masks of God. So I mentioned before, if you have a broken sink and you have a plumber come fix it, you could just as easily say God fixed your sink through that plumber. See, God wore the mask of a plumber. Or if you're being taught by a teacher, God is teaching you, but he's wearing the mask of a teacher. And so who is behind all these things is God. So God hides himself behind these different vocations, or you could say God makes himself known through them. So when your car needs fixed and you take it to a mechanic, God shows you that he'll provide for you and fix your car, and he does so through another mechanic. And so all these vocations, all these jobs that God would call us to in life, they're all important because they're all ways we serve our neighbor in love. Now, Luther recognized 4 spheres of vocation. That's just like an area where we're called to. This will make more sense as we go through. And actually, he recognized 3. The first one, though, we normally divide into 2. I'll call this the work family. So you'll want to write down work family. And also, you see there in the middle, make sure you fill out vocations and callings there in those inner circles. But the work and family. Now, in our day, the economy or our job that we go do to make money, that's kind of its own separate thing. But in Luther's day, what you did for a living in your family were really tied together. And these were kind of seen as the same sphere of existence. And the reason for this was usually children ended up doing what their parents did. If your dad was a cobbler and he fixed shoes, and you were a little boy growing up, well, what did you learn to do? You learned the family trade. And so same thing if you were a blacksmith or if your mother was a baker, you learned the craft. And those were really your options back in Luther's day. Only the richest of the rich could send their children to school and maybe pursue a different career. And so you can see how those were tied together. But in our day, they're really separate. Our family life doesn't have a huge bearing on what we will ultimately end up doing for our job in the world. And so we'll break those 2 apart in our day. You see that red line there kind of showing the distinction. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at 7 mistakes or oversights that American Christians typically make when it comes to our callings in these various areas. So we normally think of our calling to a job, but we also have a calling to our family, and we have a calling to serve our nation, and we even have a calling to our church. So we're going to go through each of those spheres and talk about what God has called us to and how we might get this wrong. When it comes to our work, big problem in America is we place our jobs as top priority over everything else. Maybe we work too many hours, we work on the weekends, we're never around for our family, we're always doing what it takes to make the money and put the food on the table, and that sort of pushes everything else out of the way. That's not always the best because we have other responsibilities than our work. Charles Swindoll had this quote one time. He said, "We're so often caught up in our activities that we worship our work. We make that the most important thing. And then when it's time to play, we end up working. Instead of going home and relaxing and rejuvenating, we work, yard work, landscaping. Maybe we take our work home." And he said, what ends up happening is then we want to play and we end up playing at our worship. And that's not good either, because worship is about bringing our worship to God, not doing things that entertain ourselves. And so we can get things all out of whack when we start with worshiping our work. And he said, no, when we work, we should work. It's time to play and relax. We should play and relax. And when it's time to worship, we should worship. But it all starts with getting our work, our job, that vocation of the economy in its proper place. Now, when it comes to the family, one of the biggest mistakes Americans make is we forget the family is the most important calling we have, okay? Look what Luther says in the Large Catechism. He says, after the first 3 commandments about God, follow the rest which relate to our neighbor. And what comes right after those first 3 about God? You know this. Next to God comes the 4th commandment, honor your father and your mother. Notice how the next most important thing to God is our families, children honoring their father and their mother. He also says God has given this walk of life, fatherhood and motherhood, a special position of honor, higher than any other walk of life under it. Sometimes you'll hear this play out in our day where maybe a mom is a stay-at-home mom, and maybe some women are at a gathering and they go around the room and they say, what do you do? And one lady says, oh, I'm a lawyer. And another one says, I'm a nurse, I'm a banker, I'm a secretary. And then you get to this woman and she just kind of sheepishly says, well, I'm just a stay-at-home mom. Well, think about that. A stay-at-home mom is a pretty important job. Now, not everybody has the luxury to be able to do that, but it's nothing to be embarrassed about. What higher calling could there be than caring for your own children, you see? And so when it comes to family, we have to realize family is the number one priority. No one else can be a father and mother to their children other than the parents. See, that's their most important role. So that's in the work and family vocation. Another sphere of our existence is the fact that we're citizens of our nation. We're Americans and we're Missourians and we live in St. Charles or St. Peter. And God has placed us into these communities and we have responsibilities there as well. Now, here's a mistake we make as citizens. Sometimes we feel like, I can't make a difference. I'm just one person. And so we just feel like we don't have any responsibilities to our state altogether. And this is where I think the seventh chief part of the catechism is helpful. Now, maybe you remember us talking about six chief parts, and there they are: 10 Commandments, Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, Holy Baptism, the Lord's Supper, and confession and absolution. But there's really a seventh chief part that we often forget about, the table of duties. And if you turn there in your catechism, it has all kinds of Bible verses from the Bible that show us what to do in all these different vocations. And when we look at the sphere of citizenry or being then we see that there's many things that we can offer our state, things we might not even normally think of. Look at Romans 13:4, obey the governing authorities. Just by following the law, you help serve your nation. Give everyone what you owe him. If taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, revenue. If respect, respect. If honor, honor. There's three things you can do: pay your taxes, give respect and honor to those in authority. 1 Timothy says, I urge, first of all, that prayers, requests, and intercessions be made for everyone, for kings and all those in authority. So that's another thing we can give in our role as citizens. We can pray for our leaders. And then finally, 1 Peter is kind of like Romans 13, submit for the Lord's sake to every authority. And so here, just with some Bible verses, we can see there's all kinds of things that we can do as citizens and have an impact. And so you see those listed there. And also think about voting. You may think, oh, I'm just one vote. Well, hey, if everybody felt that way, there'd be no votes. So you go and you vote for the candidate that you think is going to most govern and align with God's will and your values. And that's important as well. And we have a responsibility to do that, especially as Americans who have the right to vote. All right, and our last sphere of vocation would be being a disciple or being a member of a church. Not everyone has this vocation, only Christians who have been called to it through holy baptism. What are our responsibilities here, and how do we get it wrong? Well, I want to go through three things. Number one, sometimes people think, I can get this on my own. I don't need to go to church. I can just read my Bible, pray to Jesus. I don't need to be a part of a church to have Christianity in my life. Well, that's not how it works. God calls us. Part of our responsibilities as Christians is to worship him, to gather with a community of believers. You can't get the Lord's Supper, the very body and blood of Christ, sitting at home. You can't hear the words of the pastor saying, I forgive you. God using the pastor's voice to assure you of forgiveness. You don't get that sitting at home, you see. So don't think that you can get all the things that you get at church just on your own. Christianity doesn't work that way. Second, sometimes people think, someone else will do the things that need to be done at church. Well, that's not true. We can always use people to serve in every capacity. So don't just think, I'll let other people take care of that. No, be an active member of your church and think about how you can serve. Number 6, this will sound just the opposite of what I just said, but it's another problem, is sometimes people think, hey, what I do for church is more important than anything else. What about a guy who's at church every night? He sings in the choir this night, he serves on this committee, he serves on this board, and he never eats dinner with his family. And he could say, well, church things are more important than having dinner with my family. Not so, you see. All these spheres are holy callings from God. And so we don't want to serve our church so much because we think that's more important. That would be no different than the monks who just went into the monastery and did God stuff all day. No, we got to serve our neighbor through our callings as well. And then finally, sometimes people think my faith only matters at church. It doesn't matter what I do in the rest of my life. No, your calling as a disciple, you see there on the screen, it spreads out into all areas of your life. And maybe you've noticed this before. Maybe there's a church member who acts perfectly holy on Sunday mornings and they sing in the choir, but maybe they own a business in town and they're a real slave driver with their employees. They pay them very good and they bark orders at them and treat them bad, never give them time off when they need it. And, that can be a real barrier to some Christians to say, well, how is this person so nice at church, but they're so mean to their employees at work? No, our calling as disciples to be kind and caring and loving, those filter out into every area of our life. And so we don't just do church stuff when we're at church and then live our lives completely differently in the other realms. No, we live in all of these at once. And that's kind of the last thing you need to fill in here. You, the word you. See, you, one day, especially when you enter the workforce, you'll live in all these vocations at once. There's a place in the United States, I believe it's Arizona, Utah, Colorado and New Mexico. It's called the Four Corners, and there's a place you can go lay. And if you stretch out, your arms and feet can be in one state, and you can lay in all four states at the same time, right? Well, that's kind of how these spheres of our vocation work. We as Christians, we don't just live in one of them at any time. We live in all of them at the same time. We're always got a role in our family as a son or a daughter, or a father, a mother, a husband, a wife. We have jobs we go to. We have people that we supervise or people that we work underneath. We live in our nation, right? We have responsibility to pray for our leaders and maybe to serve our local community. We have a church we're a member of, and maybe we usher or help greet or mow the grass or help teach a Bible study. All these callings God calls us to. Remember last time we talked about active righteousness. Well, active righteousness is carried out through all these different vocations that every single one of us is called to. All right. So for our huddle today, what you're going to do is look up these 8 verses, and they'll be in your workbook on page 59. And in the left-hand column there, you're going to write which sphere is this verse talking about. Is this talking about our family life, our work out in the workforce? Is it talking about our job in the church, or maybe our job as citizens? So that's what you'll write in the left. And then don't forget to write in the duty. We're not going to count your workbook complete if you don't write in the right-hand column as well. You need to say, well, what is the duty there? What is God asking you to do in the church or the family or in your work life in the Bible? So don't forget, identify the appropriate sphere and then identify the duty. When you're all done with that, you can pause the video right here if you need to, or just keep listening. I'll introduce the journal assignment next. All right. Before I introduce the journal assignment, don't forget family gathering sheets. That'll be attached to email if you missed. Your memory work is Galatians 5:22 and 23. This is the fruit of the Spirit. And this is also the topic of our lesson for our final confirmation lesson. And then don't forget, there's one more week after that where we're going to have a lesson on worship that Mr. Telke will lead. That's a very enjoyable lesson. So don't forget to come there in 2 weeks. All right, here's your journal. We've been reading through the book of Ephesians. And we're going to read from Ephesians chapter 4. We're going to talk about righteousness before the world. Okay, remember, we talked about passive righteousness is how God makes us righteous before him. We don't do anything. He saves us. But before the world is that active righteousness where we go out and apply all the things we've learned in the world. And that's what today's about, is applying God's word. When we read God's word, we're thinking about, what did this mean to those Ephesians 2,000 years ago? What did that mean for them? But then we always have to ask ourselves, now that we know what it meant to them, what does it mean for us today? And so that's the focus of journaling assignment 3.4, is to read through Ephesians 4, answer some of those questions. You're going to be thinking about, what did it mean and how does it apply to my life today? All right. Hey, good seeing you. I hope you're back next week if you had to miss. And we're almost getting to the end here, so hang with us. Your second year or first year of confirmation, whichever year you're in, is almost over. Have a great day and God bless. Take care.